Alright guys, quick video here today to help you gauge how close to failure your sets in the gym really are. Firstly, I should probably mention that it's important to know how close to failure you're training, because we know that we need to be training anywhere from around 4 reps shy of failure all the way to technical failure or somewhere in between to make sure we gain muscle. So it's a good idea to know roughly how close to failure you're training when you're in the gym, so that you know if you're not leaving any gains on the table or wasting your time in the gym. Okay, so we'll start with what 4 reps in reserve looks like and what it feels like, and then we will make our way down to 0. So the clip you see here on the side of the screen is me doing a set of bicep curls at 4 reps in reserve. Typically speaking, beginners seem to find it difficult to do sets at 4 reps in reserve, because it's kind of where you draw the fine line of where the set just starts to get effective, or above it is where it doesn't really feel like you're exerting much effort at all. Intuitively, most people wouldn't really stop their set just when it starts to get difficult, but fortunately there are ways to distinguish when you're at 4 reps in reserve. So on a set of 4 reps in reserve, the last 2 or 3 reps start to slow down a bit more, and you really have to focus quite a bit to get them last couple reps. Training anything above 4 reps in reserve to, so say for example 6 RIR to 4 RIR, is typically where training starts to go from relatively easy to moderately difficult training that stimulates muscle growth. Okay, so now we'll take a look at what a set of curls look like at 3 reps in reserve. Okay, so in my experience, the only real difference besides minor change in bar speed from 4 reps in reserve to 3 reps in reserve is this is where you start to feel a bit of a lactic acid build up in the muscle that you're training. Alright, so taking another jump in intensity, the clip you see here on the side of the screen is a set of curls at 2 reps in reserve. Now the only difference I can tell from a set of curls at 3 reps in reserve and 2 reps in reserve is that there's an increased, or decreased rather, bar speed on the reps, so everything's moving a little bit slower, and there's a slightly more noticeable burn in the target muscles, so just a little bit more lactic acid build-up. Okay, so now let's take a look at what 1 reps in reserve looks like and what it feels like. A set of 1 reps in reserve is usually where the bar speed has really slowly decreased now, so you almost feel like you have to give absolutely everything to get that last rep and just eke it out all the way to the top. Another thing to note here at 1 reps in reserve is this is usually the point where you have to feel like you have to fight the weight almost to maintain a good position and prevent your form from breaking down, and you usually feel a ton of lactic acid burn and build up in the target muscle on that last rep. Okay, so the clip you can see here on the side of the screen is me doing curls to complete technical failure, so this is what we would call 0 reps in reserve. This is by far the most easy relative intensity to calculate on your sets when you're in the gym, because you simply stop your set when you're very confident you can't complete another full rep all the way up to the top and all the way down to the bottom with good technique. A true set at complete technical failure or 0 reps in reserve usually feels that you have to give absolutely every ounce of effort you've got to get the rep up, and the last rep usually moves in slow motion, or at least what feels like slow motion, and you normally get a gnarly pump on that set. So you can see in that set I actually tried to get 1 more rep, but I failed halfway up. So that would be a set at complete technical failure. If your goal is solely to gain muscle, there are some exercises that you probably shouldn't go to complete technical failure on, just purely from an injury prevention standpoint. But on a set of curls like this, it's perfectly fine if you can't get the last rep. All you have to do is lower the weight back down and then move on. But on other exercises like a bench press or a barbell back squat, if you go to 0 reps in reserve and you decide to roll the dice on another rep, if you get it halfway up, and you're fucked because you can't get another rep, you're kind of screwed if you don't have spotters there at the sides or safeties set in the rack to the proper height, because you could seriously injure yourself. Alright, so that's everything from 4 reps in reserve to 0 reps in reserve covered. You probably noticed there isn't a huge difference between 4 and 3 reps in reserve and 2 and 1 reps in reserve and so on. The reason for that is because something like measuring reps in reserve is something that's so highly individual. Some people, for example, will have super fast rep speed all the way till they hit 0 reps in reserve and it just looks like they've hit a wall. Most people won't have a change in rep speed as drastic as the one I've just mentioned, but some people will, a small minority will. So try not to rely on clips of my training or clips of some other guy's training on Instagram as the definitive guide to tracking your proximity to failure. Instead, try and think of this video as a general guideline of what certain reps in reserve landmarks tend to feel like. It'll probably take you around 5 or 6 months of training and trial and error with reps in reserve type of training for you to become pretty accustomed to where 5 reps in reserve and 4 reps in reserve and 1 reps in reserve feels like, to the point where it's super intuitive for you. But until then, there are some general recommendations you can use to help you with the reps in reserve. Firstly, you should probably know that training to failure as an absolute beginner is probably not something that you need to do to make gains, or nor is it even necessary at all. But there are some benefits to training to failure on something like an isolation exercise or a machine exercise every now and then to help you keep honest about your reps in reserve and make sure you're not lying to yourself and holding reps in the tank when you probably could go harder. Secondly, another thing to keep in mind is that most beginners tend to overshoot reps in reserve on upper body exercises like a bench press or pull-ups, in that they think they've hit 5 reps in reserve or 4 reps in reserve when really they might be at 2 or 3. And they also tend to undershoot their reps in reserve for leg training, so things like squats and Romanian deadlifts. Of course, you don't need to make any drastic changes to your training program because of that insight. It's just something to be cognizant of. And third, recording one of your working sets for your main exercise of that day in your training program can be absolutely invaluable in looking back on it and engaging your reps in reserve. In my experience, most beginners tend to think that a set was harder than it looked for me. So filming your sets can be a great way of looking at reps in reserve through a more objective lens rather than subjectively thinking it's harder than it actually was. Lastly, sometimes people think that the amount of thought and subjectivity that goes along with reps in reserve type of training makes you think that why would we even bother with reps in reserve style training to begin with? So to combat this, what you could do is start your training block or your training cycle at roughly 3 to 4 reps in reserve using rough ballpark estimates of what that stuff feels like, and then from there, week to week, you can increase the sets and or weight, and then you know gradually your reps in reserve will be decreasing over time anyway, rather than having to think about things and think, right, okay, am I at 4, am I at 3, was that 2 or was that 1? So in a sense, after that first week of training, you don't really have to think about your training at all too much. You can just come in and let the guesswork be pushed to a side by the incremental increases in either weight or sets or some combination of the two.